So I'm just going to start off by saying that this is a series of talks about a book that Esther and I co-edited that came out last year. So it's one of the LCT series and it's called Demystifying Critical Reflection. And what we do is look at this assignment called critical reflection in its many different forms across multiple different disciplines. So specifically today, I'll be looking at nursing, and I'm also going to look at some past work that we've done on social work. But Esther has a chapter on business studies. Lucy has a chapter on teacher education. There's a chapter on CLIL, on sports science. So there's lots of different disciplines looking at the way in which this particular skill or assignment is used across different disciplines to try and teach students how to, what I would say is predominantly make a connection between theory and practice. So I'll be talking a little bit more about what this assignment means, particularly in the discipline of nursing and social work as I go along in the presentation. So the book is divided into three parts. My section, this particular chapter, which is chapter 2, that I'll be drawing some material from, is part of the first part of the book, which is on uncovering critical reflection. So we really wanted to look at what is critical reflection? How do you demystify it? How do you take this sort of, I would say, and I will explain to you why, this kind of unusual assignment, particularly in many hard sort of theoretical disciplines like nursing or medicine or business studies, and then try to make it explicit, show teachers and lecturers what it is they consider good reflection, and then also develop it into pedagogy using LCT. So for us, it was really important to look at it in terms of pedagogy. So how is it really useful in the classroom? So I'd really like to hear, especially at the end, because yes, last week was Esther's presentation, and she talked about how critical reflection is used in business studies. And a lot of people talked about how they use this particular assignment in their different courses. I think a lot of people said they've used critical reflection and in different ways and talked about whether it was a successful assignment or not. So today's focus is also going to look at a specific, I guess, technical term in LCT, which is axiological constellations. And I'm looking at that in relation to what I call evaluative meanings and clusters. So I'm specifically going to talk about what is a cluster, how have Esther and I, through some of the previous work we've done and in this chapter and in this book, defined the concept of clusters and use that to look at how specific worldviews, logic, and belief systems are built up in something like a critical reflection, where students are asked to make themselves the object of analysis, in a sense, and look at a particular incident in which they were involved in nursing practice, and then think about how that relates to theory in their particular fields. And then if I will also talk about what this means for literacy experts. So me and Letitia, we were working at the National University of Singapore at the Center for English Language Communication. So we were always working in sort of a consultation role with disciplinary experts and trying to see how we could bring in our understanding of texts and writing and English for academic purposes and make it useful for lecturers within disciplines such as nursing to then think about what are the ways in which language is used to make meaning in their discipline. So I'll show you how LCT is helpful for doing that. So this is part of a much larger project, and that was what was really exciting for us about the book, was that we were able to bring in work that people had done from a project on critical thinking in applied disciplines that was part of the LCT Center at the University of Sydney, and a particular publication that we did way back in 2015 based on a unit that Esther and I were developing for the Learning Center at the University of Sydney. So they basically came to us with this mysterious critical reflection assignments and said, it's being used in the discipline of social work. Can you try and think about how to teach this effectively back to students? And when we kind of deep dived into the literature on it, we could see that there was a very amorphous understanding of what critical reflection was. So everyone was using it to test their students' understanding of theory and practice, but very few lecturers could say what it was. And show how it's deployed by students, and also explain what's considered successful. So what's the basis of success in this assignment? So it was considered important, a very necessary skill, but not one that was well thought out. So many of you might already be familiar, I'm sure everyone here who's working in higher education, with critical thinking models like Faccione's model on critical thinking, which just has these lists of what's considered critical thinking. So inference, self-regulation, analysis, explanation, evaluation, interpretation, and then purposeful reflective judgment. And as we all know, those kinds of lists aren't really useful, right? We have to then be able to show our students, how do you analyze? How do you make inferences? And in different disciplines, is it different or is it the same? So these are some of the questions that emerged, I think, when we were looking at this literature and trying to find a really good definition of critical thinking. We found that it was considered a sub-skill of critical reflection was considered a sub-skill, and it was this idea of making purposeful, reflective, fair-minded judgments about what to do or what to believe. Now, for me, that is not very useful because it wasn't teachable, right? So we were thinking about, okay, so how do we try to unpack what this means? How do we try to break it down and make it into useful pedagogy for our students? So way back to make that 2015 paper with Carl, and we worked on it in relation to semantic gravity, because we kind of thought, okay, Carl's working on knowledge building, and we wanted to go to him with this assignment and be like, what kind of knowledge is this? And how can we try to demystify it so that it's useful in a pedagogical sense for the students, and enables their learning rather than leaves them puzzled and scratching their heads. So the traditional definition of reflection, I'm sure all of you have heard of Dewey, huge figure, for example, in NUS when I was working there, sort of the education philosophy. So again, an interesting definition: active, persistent, careful consideration of supposed forms of knowledge, but also vague. Like, what does that actually mean? How does it look in a text? What does it mean when students are writing it up, for instance, or being asked to critically reflect? How do they demonstrate the capacity to do that? And there was a lot of definitions in the field, but none of those definitions really showed you the process by which this was happening. So we wanted to try and understand how to go about doing that. There was also a lot of research, but even at the end of some of the sort of big books that did a whole review of all of the work that's been done on critical reflection, like this book by Fook, there was also this kind of call for more rigorous and focused investigation. There has to be a series of studies conducted over a long period of time, collaborations from different sites and disciplines, addressing a broader question of critical reflection more holistically, and then also thinking about this idea that a lot of the disciplines that have, which is that somehow critical reflection, the capacity to critically reflect, leads to human flourishing. So that's like the big, I don't know how to put it, but the sort of the big goal that they have in mind, that somehow it makes you a better person, a better practitioner, a better, person in your field of study somehow. So they were asking this question and then saying we need more rigorous studies. So I'm hoping that this is what this book is actually doing, right? Trying to be more rigorous and focused and theoretical, and trying to solve this question about what is critical reflection, using multiple frameworks from LCT to do that and to make it more visible. So my particular framework that I used was axiological constellations, and I wanted to look at it in relation to nursing professionals and nursing professional values. So this is where your undergraduate student who's sort of been in the classroom in nursing has been going through all the nursing procedures, the practices, how to take blood pressure, how to clean a wound, but they haven't actually been out to the field and had field practice yet. And critical reflection is a huge component of that field practice, because that's the first time that you meet the patient and they're face-to-face interacting with the patient. And often for students, it can be very emotionally confronting. So this is where this assignment comes in. And I think before nursing, sometimes in some subjects, I wasn't sure that it was entirely relevant, but in nursing, it's extremely relevant because the emotional factor of it is very, very high. The students do face situations in which there are emergencies, etc., where their emotional response sort of makes it difficult for them to have the appropriate professional response as well. So this is the challenge that the practitioners are, the lecturers are dealing with, telling them there's going to be very high emotions, but how do you regulate that so that you're able to move on with your practice? You might be disgusted by a wound, or upset that someone's collapsed or fallen, and it's your responsibility, but you have to move forward because that's your role as a professional. You can't let that cloud your judgment. Even if you do within this safe space of field practice, then you have to be able to go back and explain the process and think about how you could have responded differently, and then attempt to do that in the future. So that's the purpose of this particular assignment. So we did a very large sort of project. I won't go through all of this with you because I want to actually get to the data, but it was Letitia, I, and Mark. All of us have chapters across the book. So we did a big sort of collaborative interdisciplinary research grant. We were very excited because the nursing staff actually saw us talk about critical reflection with LCT tools in a separate presentation, and they approached us and said, oh, this looks really interesting. It looks like it's going to solve this problem that we have, that we're asking students to write what we think is a very important genre, and they're not somehow doing a very good job of it. They're just being descriptive, very on the surface. So how do we get them to be more critical, as what they called it. So we thought, okay, let's look at this in a greater detail and try to help them identify what constitutes what they call deep reflection. So what is deep reflection, first of all? And then how can we make that visible so that the lecturers can, first of all, see how the students go about demonstrating deep reflection, and then also explicitly teach that back to the students. This is what we consider a successful example of deep reflection that was useful in this context, and they could use that. We tried to build in the LCT tools to try and make that evident to the lecturers. So we analyzed a lot of scripts, and we analyzed low, mid, and high. So very importantly here, we didn't mark them as low, mid, and high. It's the disciplinary lecturers who did that. They had this bunch of determined grades, and they had like all of the grades sorted out, and they just shared the pack with us so that we could see how they, with their rubrics and also with their knowledge of nursing, were analyzing and grading these texts. And then it gave us an opportunity to say, okay, let's analyze these texts using linguistics, which is specifically genre, and appraisal, which is about evaluative meaning in text. And then also LCT appraisal can feed into LCT. I'll show you how a little bit later in terms of evaluative meaning. But we also then went back to the lecturers with the scripts and what we learned about what was considered the basis of success, what we thought the high scoring scripts were doing. And we had focus group discussions, really fantastic ones, which were opened eyes, and they were so incredibly knowledgeable about their disciplines and about what they wanted their students to achieve and why they thought their high scoring students were achieving that and the low scoring students weren't. So it gave us a real disciplinary insight into these texts so that we could then have this really strong collaborative interdisciplinary understanding of what we were working with as we were developing a rubric and then writing up the teaching materials to support the teaching of critical reflections for this particular unit. So what's the task, right? Very quickly, I'm sure most of you are familiar with these tasks. Many of you may have actually written them. We had to write them for promotion in NUS, and a lot of people struggled with them. So I did workshops using LCT on how to do this for promotion, because people will come to me and say, I don't know how to write this kind of subjective. I did something wrong, something happened, I had a challenge, and then what could I do to fix that? So first, students were expected to choose
Sorry,
a
Namali, you said for promotion. Who had
Yeah,
to,
for promotion.
they had to write critical reflection
Yeah, as part of the
essays,
document.
or they had to
Yes,
set critical reflection tasks? I'm confused.
no, they had to do a critical reflection. So like, Letitia, if you want to be professor, you have to write a dossier, and part of that dossier also to have a critical reflection. It was like a highly valued genre in which you
Okay.
showed a challenge you had in a teaching problem and then how you overcame that challenge.
Oh, okay.
Big on that. Yeah. And a lot of people were stumped by because, you've got physics lecturers who are just working on physics and they're like, I have no idea what I'm supposed to do here, because I think most people come from their disciplinary knowledge and not from education-based knowledge. So it was interesting to see how those genres were used and panned out at that level for promotion by people who are, incredibly well educated in relation to this same kind of process. So the students in nursing were asked to choose difficult or challenging situations to focus on, reflect on their own actions, as well as those of participants. So they were allowed to observe. They weren't allowed to be critical of or be very negative of other people, but they were encouraged to say things like, I saw how someone stepped in and did something different to me and how that worked or didn't work, if that's what happened in that particular situation. And then they need to relate these situations that they describe to a particular theoretical framework in nursing. So in relation to nursing procedures and practices. And as I argue, one step beyond that, which is nursing values. So what does it mean to be a nurse, and what values do you need to embody in order to be a part of that particular discipline or practice or professional body? So it was quite interesting. Now, at that time, the lecturers had given the students Gibbs reflective cycle. I'm sure many of you have seen it. A series of steps, descriptive, what happened, what were you thinking and feeling, evaluation, what was good or bad, analysis, what sense can you make of the situation, conclusion, what else could you have done, an action plan, if it arose, what would you do again? So it's supposed to be, I suppose, to a certain extent, by the time it gets to analysis, it's becoming more and more complex, right? As you can imagine, many of the students, particularly in the lower levels, were just describing. So they were just staying at that first stage. They were just what happened next, then this went wrong, and then, they might share a few feelings, but they would never get to the evaluation, analysis, conclusion, and action plan component of it. Those, they sort of stopped at a particular basic level. So the lecturers were telling us some of the issues. Students were predominantly descriptive. There was no attempt at deep reflection, which we were trying to uncover what that means. And there was no connection of practice to theory. There might be a theoretical chunk in the middle where they'll say something like, this is what wound care means in nursing practice, but they wouldn't relate it to that particular incident and try to say, okay, this is what I did, but nursing care suggests that wounds should be dealt with in this way, and that's what I need to do in future. So the lecturers say, this is one of the focus group discussion transcripts. When you reflect, you can't just reflect and look back. That's remembering. You need to put your thought processes into it. It has to have an outcome. There's analysis taking place. The goal is to analyze and make sense of events. So, what does that actually mean when we're looking at it in relation to texts? So there is already developing, there's a cosmology that's behind all of this. It's a whole set of belief systems and values that emerge from the discipline as expected, right? So the big one in this context was core competencies in nursing from the Singapore Nursing Board. So there was something that students are introduced to, which talks about a minimum set of performances, about qualities, attributes, and skills for a registered nurse. You had to be able to embody these at the end of your time as a student nurse in order to show that you're ready to become a professional. So the idea of competency has a specific set of meanings, its necessary knowledge and attitudes and skills, and the nurse must possess in order to perform a set of defined activities to an expected standard. So there's a lot going on here in terms of knowledge that then the students need to sort of distill and then unpack and relate to their own experiences. So just to show you, the thing that I'm going to be looking at, management of care, which is how does a student in their text, in their critical reflection written text, relate the concept of managing care to a particular critical incident that they encountered. They have to do a number of things. They have to demonstrate effective communication, ensure consistent, continuous, holistic quality of care, maintain a safe environment, through risk management strategies, and apply strategies to promote health and prevent illnesses. So the students have this underlying set of procedure, standards, beliefs, skills that sort of underlie all of their practice within the field placements that they enter into. So it's interesting to see how they can use a single, and I'll show you what I mean by this, how they can use a single incident and then relate it to these different aspects. Now they pick something like nursing competency, and then they break it up into what does nursing competency mean in relation to knowledge? What does it mean in relation to attitudes? What does it mean in relation to skills? So the really high-ranking students are able to understand the underlying logic of the standards, the professional standards, and then embody that into their texts somehow in a systematic way that allows them to demonstrate that they have already embodied the values of what it constitutes to be a professional nurse. Any questions? Is that no? Okay, so now I'm going to get into the LCT part of it, which is the axiological clusters. So for us to understand how students take a single incident that they face and then relate it to these big values, beliefs, logic systems that constitute the discipline of nursing, we wanted to start at the smallest unit, I suppose, which for us in this instance is axiological clusters. So I'm just going to be going through what that means. So for us, for me and Esther, some of the other chapters in the book, like Letitia's chapter, we were looking at axiological clusters as an instance of evaluation and evaluated. Okay, what is being evaluated? How is it being evaluated? And does it have a positive or negative charging? And the main thing was the clusters had to be recurring patterns of meaning. So the same evaluated thing had to repeatedly have a particular charging associated with it before it became a cluster over time. And then we called it a cluster. And I'm going to show you how that happens in our text. So several clusters grouping together gives us a picture of what's happening, how an axiological constellation might be forming, and then how that might, develop into something even larger, like an axiological cosmology. So it's just giving us snapshots of the larger picture of the values that people are referring to when they are dealing even with this small unit of meaning, which is just there's a thing and it's being evaluated as either being positive or negative. It's being charged as either being positive or negative. So let me give an example of what I mean by that, okay? So evaluation, it can be something like severe implications and evaluated elderly patients, and the charging is negative, right? Oh, sorry, I've got the wrong, wait, let me go to the next one. Got the next one. Okay, so ignore my little circle over there. What it should be is negative evaluations of elderly patients, right? The outcomes for elderly patients. I've left nursing students up there. But what it basically means is that we're looking at two things, which is what is being evaluated and what is the item of evaluation, and is it negative or positive? And you can be you don't have to go into so much detail about the thing that's the types of evaluation, which we do in linguistics. We can categorize different types. You can stick to the level of is it positive or negative on a much broader level, if that's where you want to stay. So the question is something repeatedly being evaluated as being negative, or is something repeatedly being evaluated as positive? And as that builds over time, how does that start to shape the text? And as we all know, something can be repeatedly negative, 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 and then over time culturally, you can actually stop being explicit about negatively or positively charging something. It can just take on that meaning, and every time you say it to the right group of people, they understand what the underlying positive, negative meanings are and who they align with, right? So let's look at how this first cluster is formed. And this is a student talking about the concept of falls. So she basically says a big implication for elderly patients in nursing is falling, and falls has a specific theoretical meaning and set of associations with it. So if you fall, you can have severe complications, suffer from head injuries. It can confine them to wheelchairs, prolong their hospitalization, escalates to higher health costs and lower quality of life. You can see that there are different references here. So now we know she's referring to the theory. It's not the specific incident that's happening in her field placement. She's referring to the theory. And you can see all of the meanings here are negative, and they are accumulating over time to create a cluster. So for elderly patients, and again, we have the repeated evaluated. So we have the same thing being evaluated for elderly patients, they, them, patient, 1 in 4 patients. So we know that repeatedly, the impact that something like a fall can have on the patients is something that is negative. So we start to see a pattern emerging. And as that pattern emerges, we begin to understand that it is starting to create a particular cluster of meanings. Okay, I'm just going to. So for the students, under knowledge, now they've started to build up, and down to the very bare bones, this idea that fault has negative implications for their patients. And that's the little cluster of knowledge that emerges from this overall constellation of what is important in nursing values. You need to have the right kind of knowledge, you need to have the right kind of attitudes towards the knowledge, and you need to have the right kinds of skills. If you don't have the right kinds of skills, and this is the crucial point in critical reflection, you're saying, I didn't have the right skills, or I didn't have the right knowledge, or I didn't have the right attitude, right? And you are saying, I do know what that is within the discipline of nursing. And therefore, next time around, I'm going to adjust my attitude, I'm going to upgrade my skills, or I'm going to make myself more knowledgeable, which is what this student is demonstrating in this assignment. So it builds up a really big picture, and it actually develops according to how the text develops. So if you look at the way that the text develops, when they're first describing in the nursing in-person narrative, my patient had a fall. And then they say, I tried to do all these things. I locked the commode, placed the grab bars within reach, lay his dirty clothes on the floor for him to step on so that he doesn't slip. And there was it was frustrating. I should have been more attentive and caring. The situation went out of control and the elderly patient slipped. And then they go to the theoretical meanings associated with that. This is the next stage of their assignment. They're moving on from the description stage to the evaluation and analysis stage. And here they bring in knowledge. And then they start to go to the literature, and they're saying, I'm pulling out from the literature what falls, the implications of falls are, and what I need to do. And by doing that, I'm building up this idea that I know very well what this nursing competency is of maintaining a safe environment to ensure a patient's safety. They're building up a picture of that, and they're moving towards that constantly in their assignment. And then they've got this, what all nurses should do, right? They've got this little shift happening from what I did and my personal reaction and my attitudes and my skills to knowledge in nursing in general, and then a little transformation, which they need to demonstrate at the end. I felt I could do this, and felt I could improve this, which is your classic critical reflection, overall, how the entire assignment unfolds. Description of what happened. Something didn't work, something went wrong. I went to the theory. I looked at the nursing standards. I understood that I was being incompetent. This is what nursing competency looks like. And I know that I need to transform. So next time I know what to do. And it builds up literally from these tiny clusters to a bigger and bigger picture of what constitutes nursing values. And I can show you how that happens in another discipline as well, if you want to see how clusters work. Okay, so this is clusters in social work, same thing. Okay, but here, a bit more complex. We've got a student talking about, again, professionalism. So big logic worldview stuff coming in. I am a social worker. This is what I do in relation to the entirety of social work. This is what my position is, right? And then aligning with those values. So what do social workers do? They have an obligation to work for social justice, to advocate with and on behalf of disadvantaged and marginalized, work from an anti-oppressive stance, endeavor to work in partnership wherever possible, assist clients to gain more control, overcome obstacles in meeting their aspirations, and to ensure their voices are heard. Right? So really complex stuff coming from a very specific disciplinary framework. All of it building up to positive charging of evaluating the social worker. So, what is the social worker? Empowered and empowering within the context of social work. And it's all from these little building blocks of clusters of meaning that over time create this repeated pattern. So this is the social worker in this assignment, another assignment that I looked at. And then this is what the client looks like. The client has a negative charging associated with them. If the social worker is powerful.
Can I
Yes.
just ask, when people were doing their promotion stuff, did they have did they have to positively did they have to show that were they positively charging themselves? Do you know? Or do you have to do some sort of
Oh no,
Catholic
you have to,
confessional?
yeah, you have to do Catholic confessional guilt.
Yeah, that I did this thing
Yes.
wrong and I'm really sorry and I've learned
Yeah.
from it.
Yes, you do. You do. You have to say, I, you can reframe it as I was faced with a challenge, and some of it's really trivial. I couldn't believe it. Like sometimes you read like associate prof promotions, and people were so mystified as to what to say. They were saying really challenging things like, my great challenge was that my students said that they didn't like my how my slides were formatted, and you know,
Yeah, I suppose
therefore.
there's more. Yeah, I suppose, yeah, with a kind of promotion, you don't want to be too, you can't build up such a positive or negative like so strongly, and you don't want to seem. It's a bit like those, the thing in job interviews where they say, what's your weakness or whatever. It's perfectionism and my general brilliance. It's just.
Oh, Carl, if only I had known that when I went in for an interview a few weeks ago. That would have been a wonderful one to use.
Mm. But yeah, I was just wondering whether
Namali?
this, yeah.
Yes, sorry. Esther,
Oh,
jump
sorry,
in.
I didn't mean to interrupt with Carl.
No, no, go
Go
ahead.
ahead. Yeah, I was just wondering, is this something cultural in Singapore, do you think? Because in grant applications that I did, I was told by, professors who did a lot of those to be very positive. So the critical reflection is basically positively charging the already positive, basically saying, I'm already awesome and I promise to be more awesome in the future, so give me the grant money. Um,
Mm.
and you're not supposed to say anything negative in a grant application. And promotion is very similar, at least when I did it in Australia. So,
No, 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 no. Elle, you remember what it was like? We're supposed to grovel a bit. We're supposed to be like, oh, I didn't know something. It was bad to say I did actually know the answer to that. You know what? I had a really good, um, I had a great semester. My evaluations were outstanding and my students loved me. No, no, you're supposed to be able to show that even when you're going for really high level promotions. So there were professors who would come and speak about their associate prof promotions, and they would be like, oh, I had to make sure that, I really reflected deeply on what could I do about becoming better. And I used to always think, why not talk about how you progressed your field, or, what
yeah, no.
amazing contribution to knowledge there was. I was completely shocked that this was such a, there are people who are working in huge labs and doing incredible things, and they've actually been told you don't have great feedback so from your students, your undergrads or whatever it is, and then now you have to pick out, you have to sit there, and people would do like, in vivo analyses and like do clusters and clouds and do an analysis, proper analysis of their student feedback to try and determine what their students didn't like about them. It was like a really existential crisis on
Nam, can I jump in here to just echo what Esther was saying about cultural values? You have that kind of parallel. I don't know how cultural is, or maybe a small culture of the university or your department, but you have to sense how values like humility and things like that are going to promote you or to argue your case. And so it's that incredible balance that you have to achieve by saying you are excellent, but you're also very humble. And then you get completely contradicting feedback. So on your director of whatever will tell you, will encourage culturally around, the humility, I'll say this about my colleague because they'll be too shy to say it themselves. So you kind of get the message. But then you send your dossier to like a mentor, and they will tell you exactly the opposite. Say, you're actually underselling yourself. And then there is a gender issue there as well. There's a colleague of mine has analyzed that, and fairly invariably, I think, those two words don't go together. But anyway, women tend to have a difficulty kind of like saying, this is what I did and that was the impact. They just kind of turn around. And I was doing it myself, and I didn't think I was like that. But I kept saying things like, hopefully this will have an impact. So yeah, they're an interesting genre, definitely.
So just to help Namali back to the essays, I'm assuming that the reason why they have to positively charge the profession is because they're a student of the profession. And I'm not sure why they have to negatively evaluate the client, except that they're presenting a challenge. It's not saying that all clients are a big pain in the ass.
Marginalized, yes. Disadvantaged, marginalized.
All right, okay. Yeah, so when you say it's negatively evaluating, it's actually, in a wider sense, that could be, these are positive values for some people, if you know what I mean. In certain fields, that they are disadvantaged is positively valued. But yeah, so I wanted to bring you back to this and think about, why do they positively charge the social work? Well, I suppose it's because they're students of social work. And secondly, why do they negatively evaluate the client in their challenge?
Because they're giving themselves legitimacy in the field, right? They're giving themselves legitimacy in the discipline, where they're like, this is my role, is to empower the client who's disadvantaged and marginalized. That's like the ultimate, guilt factor, where, oh, these poor, that's how it emerges in the text anyway, that there's a sense of power imbalance. And then there's always some kindly person on the powerful side who's going to guide the unpowerful into the empower. Empower is a really tricky word, right? That makes you squirm. But seriously, Ka, you're talking about I don't think the world is like that anymore. As in, we don't, these kinds of being disadvantaged and marginalized is just bad now. There's no way you can.
Namali, let's not, despite the fact that the orange moron and would-be Mussolini is dominating, sucking the life out of all news cycles, let's not universalize the US experience. It's still very, very much a case that DEI is seen as very positive here.
Okay, let's leave it there then. Yeah. But yeah, so I think it's just fascinating how you've got this sort of like this need by students to find out what they think. I mean, these are the really good students, right? The outstanding students to go out there. This particular one that I'm showing you of the social worker is actually from a published set of essays that students wrote. Like the lecturers thought they were so outstanding that they published them in a volume as part of, I think, Sydney University Press. And then they were considered like exemplary models of this particular genre of critical reflection within social work. And some of them were, it's interesting, they had a lot of what we call oppositional charging. So they've got something is good and something is bad, and they work together as a bigger sort of cluster in a sense. They have their own set of meanings that combine, and they always work together that way. So the student switches it. She's in a position where she's not in power in a particular instance, and then she has to put the world order back where it began at the end of the critical reflection. So there's hugely complex things going on where people are building clusters, breaking them down, building them up again. But ultimately, what seems to matter is, are the students going back to the disciplinary values? Can they identify what they are? And can they show that they are able to affiliate to them, or show that they're able to reproduce those values within a text by evaluating their own practices and their own experiences within the field? It's a really hard genre. And the thing is, a lot of people will think, oh, there's just a little bit of emotion in it. Like, the student might say, I felt sad, or I felt unhappy, or I felt a bit frightened by what happened. But there's so much more going on that when you look at texts in terms of axiology, that emerges about how much, good, bad, positive, negative meanings are emerging within this, and how that's creating much larger ways of looking at the world, or belonging to a discipline, or fields, or ideological structures, or even, in the case of what me and Letitia are talking about in relation to these critical reflection narratives, having a cultural element to it, a hugely complex cultural element of in which situation, and I will remember this for the future, Esther, maybe there will be a place where I work where suddenly I'll have to be, I'm great and I'm going to be even better. because I'm like fully bought into the narrative of, you know, I've made mistakes and forgive me for my sins and I will reform. So that's it's built into me now. I've been working on this and this is what I'm ready to do. Esther and I were actually talking about how there's some really interesting critical reflection narratives. She was saying even in things like radicalization work that she's been doing, where there are people who say they come back from being radicalized and then they say, I am looking back at this instance, right, Esther? So it's everywhere, this idea that you can have someone who used to be a fundamentalist or jihadist, and then they say, I'm not any longer.
Yeah, that's actually very interesting. And they do seem to follow the Christian confession cycle. I did wrong, I repent. Now I'm working on helping radicalized people de-radicalize themselves and exit these movements. It would be an interesting project to analyze.
That would be the corollary, wouldn't it, of going into some sort of cult-like group, isn't it? You have to be, the old person has to die, the new person has to be born, and there has to be some sort of transition between the two. This is like, you get a lot of this stuff in anthropology, where you have to somehow renounce and slop off the old person in order to become the new person. So I assume the same thing happens on the way out as in the way in.
Something like that, yes.
With initiation.
I haven't looked into it in great detail, but it would make a great project, I think.
And what worries me is that, you know, you get a lot of higher education research like Schulman that will talk about these concepts like implicit pedagogy. And this is what they're referring to. These assignments where everyone feels a bit uncomfortable. They know that it's got some sort of value, especially in particular contexts like nursing, for instance, but everyone feels uncomfortable because they're not quite sure how to manage things like technicalizing emotion in a way that is so uncomfortable for people who are working within disciplines where they like to think of themselves as, I'm in a rational discipline, there's no evaluation and emotion and ideological meanings coming into this. So I think it's also used as a really good gatekeeper, right? In the arts, where people will say, I mean, Faccione's study, which I talked about earlier, where he basically goes and interviews like hundreds of people about what do they think critical thinking is. They're like, I think it means, and I have a feeling when I see something critical, and I kind of know when I see analysis that it's very good, but then they can't make it explicit to their students, they can't teach it to them. So, you know, they are hoping that their students come with a particular set of values and they can understand how to write these kinds of incredibly complex genres, particularly in like first year, you know, when they're brand new to the discipline. How do they know how to do these things unless they're from a particular cultural background or from a particular, I don't know, I feel like it's a really hard genre and one that not everyone has access to or feels comfortable with or does well in. So a lot of students complain about it and do badly in it. So it was kind of nice to be able to say, look, we can actually show you what good looks like. I sometimes felt uncomfortable, though. I will admit that. There are moments when you show what good looks like and you think, I'm not entirely sure that I want them to be able to reproduce this kind of genre because I don't want them to do it as a, you know, I'm going to get good marks to do this. But I guess...
Natasha, do you want to answer that question? Because it's a really good one.
Nam, you know, you made like the point that frequency is very important in forming those associations, and so it just got me thinking. I put it in the chat. It just got me thinking. But I know we are talking about two different things. Maybe what happens in a discipline is very different in terms of forming those very deep values. But I was just thinking: is frequency the only thing that is at stake? And of course, I'm now talking a bit more about political kind of rhetoric. And is it frequency? And if it's frequency, what is it? Is it over a massive amount of time? Is the association done in a massive range of different kind of contexts and different modes and so on? Or is it something else? Is it like also like in political rhetoric? I would think that the shock of an association kind of has as much impact as something that is frequently repeated, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe something that is outlandish.
Okay,
Yeah.
I would say that if it's a shock, it's only because it's going against an already established coupling and somehow destabilizing or cluster and somehow destabilizing it, I think. So we all take a certain set of values for granted. And the fun thing is when you're, I don't know, cluster fucking that, then you are just in a position where people, if the people are in the same way aligned, they're going to be shocked by it. If they're not going to be shocked by it, right? Like I was shocked recently because I'm not on Instagram about the trad wife phenomenon. Like I was, what's going on here?
Not
Like,
again, not another one of those obsessions, ma'am. Stop it. I don't want to know.
Am I a trad wife? And I'm like, is the thing that we do now? Like I was very confused by what does it mean, what are all the implications, and I realized such a strange shift that's happening culturally, and so I think what lots of women and people do in general for their families or for their children or whatever it is now become something associated with being traditional. It's very strange to me, like, okay, so you need food. Well, everybody needs to make
that's
food.
an excellent point. The fact that
it
only happens within your own context and your established values. Yeah, that's
It's when your established values are overturned is when the fun stuff is happening, right? So I guess that's why it's confronting for so many students. It's uncomfortable for them to turn around and look at themselves. And they're also being forced to look at something where something has really shaken them, especially in something like nursing, where we know there's a lot of, like I remember the lecturers saying that as the students get to their fourth year, they're dealing with disgust a lot. They're doing lots of wound cleaning and things. And disgust is a huge factor that you have to overcome in order to be a professional nurse. You can't, and anyone who's been in a situation where they've been sick and somebody's cared for them, you know what I mean, where you're in that, or you looked after a small child or whatever, there's some barrier you need to get over. And they say it's a huge psychological one. And the nurses need to get over it very fast and move on so that they don't make the person feel uncomfortable in that situation. They just normalize it, whereas for us as a person, an individual going into that situation, we'd be shocked, horrified, disgusted, and afraid in a sense. So there's something, it's always interesting when you can pick moments, I think culturally, where something you think this is shocking, and then you wake up and realize, oh, wait a minute, I'm the only one who thinks it's shocking, everyone else thinks it's perfectly normal, and the world has moved on. That kind
She's going back there. She's going back.
I think, Letitia, to get back to your question, I think we could use the concepts of intertextuality and also historical periodicity to go back and trace the developments of these ideas. And, most of you know the Overton window, how there's an idea that's shocking today. And then in 10 years' time, it's become completely mainstream and normalized. That used to be considered extreme and not anymore. And that's what we've been experiencing the last, I don't know how many years. So I think we could trace back how these certain ideas, couplings became normalized and stabilized as a cluster. And what was the point when they were destabilized, as Namali put it? And then what are these new values? And then it's basically about tracing it back over time. And we do this kind of work when we look at radicalization and how certain groups evolve. And Namali, you mentioned threadwives. I mean, how many times does the same idea get repeated in a tweet or in a meme or on Instagram via a photo? So, repeated patterns of the same clusters pushed out thousands and thousands of times is the same strategy that people who spread disinformation use, or you could think about Russian information warfare. So it's this idea of repeating the same thing until it becomes lodged in people's minds. So we could talk about it for a really long time, but I'll hand it back to Namali.
I mean, I remember like Carl's paper where he does those two clusters on teachers, like teacher-centeredness versus student-centeredness. I mean, the amount of job ads that I've looked at where I'm like, oh no, I have to write a teaching philosophy in which I have to pretend that I'm no, because that's what the criteria are. They'll be like, are you student-centered and using interactive techniques to engage your students? And I'm thinking, okay, so cut out all the stuff about knowledge, replace it with all this stuff about I mean, if you're going to play the game, which I had to do. But yeah, so I'm just thinking about how it's so clear, and it's almost as if overwhelmingly most people would see teacher-centered as a bad thing, right? Certainly for me and Letitia, who come from that, and Esther as well, come from that English language teaching background, which is where our major field, we all started there. It's a terrible word. You don't say teacher-centered. You don't talk about knowledge and content. Your students have to be having a great time and engage, and they have to be the focus. There was a big thing in NUS about student facilitators. So, I mean, I think Letitia and I were just sitting in that audience with furrowed brows, and everyone else was like, yes, the students should be teaching the class, deciding on their curriculum. At one point, they decided that the students should be equal partners in curriculum building. Like, goodness, did we just write ourselves completely out of the narrative, leave behind knowledge, in order to, become student-centered, to the point where, please, student, teach thyself, self-learning, self-everything. So yeah, so I think it's interesting to be able to get a set of texts where you can clearly see the process from beginning to end, because when you look at it in cultural terms, it's so complex. And looking at the kind of thing that Esther's looking at, it's so complex. And when Carl talks about it happens in disciplines, that's happening, the exact same thing, but happening at such a complex level. I think it's fascinating on such a lot of data as well. So I think with all the computational work that's going on, the access that you can have to these kinds of, how do clusters take on positive, negative meanings, and then, how does it change? How does it go back? How does it, disintegrate? How is it taken apart? It's fascinating.
Namali, can I just ask a question?
Yes.
Doing cluster analysis 101, looking for clusters within this kind of analysis. I'm just trying to follow the discussion and going, okay, if I'm doing this for the first time and I've got my data set, what is going to guide me to make a claim? I think I've got a cluster now.
Okay, so I think it's just a question of asking, can you see a positive or negative charging? Is something positively or negatively being evaluated? What is the thing that's being evaluated? Is it a person? Is it a thing? Is it incident that's happened? What is the thing that's being evaluated, and is it positive or negative? I think that's the most basic step to start at, because a lot of the negative meanings are not explicitly, somebody isn't saying it's bad to, it's good to assist your clients, but we all know the concept of assisting your clients has a positive association with it, right? So I think everyone can intuitively tap into what's considered positive or negative. But for me and Esther, and obviously Lucy and Letitia, for us, it's all about, can you separate what's being evaluated from the meanings that are used to, the things that are being used to evaluate it, the evaluations? Can you see that it's overwhelmingly positive or negative? And after a while, do you see the same thing being evaluated over and over again? So here it's social worker, social worker, social worker. In the nursing text, it would be, I, or it would be patient, patient, patient. It would be mentor, mentor, mentor. So when you start to see the same evaluated emerging over and over again, and a whole host of meanings associated with it that are overwhelmingly positive or negative, then you should be cluing on to, here's a cluster, and then see, is it developed and maintained throughout the text, or is the person about to now do the switcheroo where they're going to suddenly they'll do an oppositional charge. This is what I thought, but now I've changed my mind, and that's actually a positive thing, or that's actually a negative thing. So you've got to be careful about that. So I think about it along the sequence of text, and can you see these meanings emerging? We all intuitively know what's positive and negative, right? But if we can break it up into its different components, I think it's really valuable, because then you can justify what you're seeing in the text down to a very minute level, a small unit, and then show how that small unit develops into these larger world values. And that sometimes surprises me, really. I'm thinking, my God, such big values just being represented in these small evaluation clusters that are building over text over time. And in the text, sometimes you might just find 3 or 4 major clusters that are just moving around in positive, negative associations throughout large texts. And you're amazed that somebody can sustain that throughout. And it's amazing when you can identify it. I think it's really fun. I hope that answered the
Yeah,
question.
that was great. Thank you. Much clearer. Thanks.
Do you want to keep telling us about the thing, Namali?
Sorry, Carl?
Do you want to keep going with the analysis?
Yeah, sure. So this was, as I said, like the social worker versus the client in the social work text begins to show up these oppositional clusters. So oppositional clusters are really fascinating because it's going to be something is positive, 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 and as a result of that, something is negative, negative, negative. So in Carl's work on the teacher-centered classrooms and all of the meanings associated with that as being negative in higher education or in education in general versus, the student-centered and how that takes on a whole bunch of meanings which are associated with being positive. And they seem to stick together. So they're making larger units of meaning that have, I think, more they start to build up their own little worldview that emerges, which is quite different from, and also I'd say that they are quite different in the sense that it's not about how did I feel in a particular instance, but how does this relate to my overall disciplinary values or professional outlook on things, or how I'm positioned in relation to something that's happening by value of my cultural values or my experiences or my gender. So there's really big questions that are sort of, I think, being encompassed in these little building block units that we can see within text that help us tap into some things that people are always telling us are difficult to put a finger on. Like, I know that this text is somehow, leading me towards believing something that I know is not fundamentally true, but I don't know how it's doing that. Well, clusters are forming and they keep reinforcing. They begin to reinforce in oppositional meanings. Something is positive, so something is negative. And that builds up a certain set of logic that by the time you get to the end of the text, you're convinced of something that you think, wait, that's not what I would normally align with, but it's convincing because the text has done a lot of hard work to get there, I think. So for us, really, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, if I just can say, I just wonder whether the stability of those clusters then really is dependent on the field. So you could imagine that nursing is pretty confident about its values, its ethics, it's got codes of practice and etc. So there's not a lot of maybe challenge to those clusters. But if we go into the educational domain and you were talking about teacher-centeredness and like I've just put up co-construction and all of those things, all of those terms, which kind of often tend to be created with fairly good intentions. But then what happens is I think they kind of get split into different associations. And so after that happens, so you understand why teacher-centeredness would be criticized, right? Because it is compared within a context of extreme prescriptivism and so on. So it makes sense at the beginning, but then it sort of gets distorted into different things. And it means that, decades later or whatever later, maybe we have different associations and clusters forming, and then we just don't know. When we talk to each other, we actually don't really know what we're talking about anymore. Like I'll take my recent thing was I wrote something about critical pedagogies. That means absolutely nothing because we kind of lost the criteria to evaluate. So that was just, I was just wondering whether the stability of those clusters then is really linked to the type of discipline we're talking about as well. Maybe it's something to do with horizontal and verticality and
I think students can't do much challenging, no matter how much there's this idea that, critical thinking is, the student sort of like, engaging with the field in a way that allows them a tremendous amount of freedom to challenge concepts. There's nothing like that going on. I think a lot of critical thinking, because they're students, they're still trying to get an understanding of what their discipline means, how they work in it. there's a lot of conforming, and we mentioned that in another chapter of ours, me and Esther as well, right? There's this idea that you're aligning, you're conforming, you're reproducing, rather than challenging, because you want to be a part of that group or profession, the community of practice kind of thing that comes up in teacher education, higher education, this idea that you want to belong to a community of practice and you want to demonstrate that you have the capacity to belong to it because you understand what the underlying values of that discipline are. So I think that's interesting. But then, if you go out into the larger field, and then once people become professionals, then there's some really interesting things going on there where you can take the expected clusters and then sort of break them down. I mean, we all do that as well, right? I mean, if you're writing for a grant and you look at another grant application, you're already thinking towards what does this entire university align themselves with? I mean, we all know this is happening, for example, with tech. It's like taking over. You can't have a conversation without someone being like, AI and technology and ChatGPT and trying to show their ability to understand and affiliate with it. And there are different ways of doing it, right? To show that you are competent in it, that you can use it, that you're well versed in it, that you're comfortable with using AI and it enhances student learnings. And then, of course, there are also some people who are a bit confused and they're like, but does it really? Did we need it? Is it effective? Is it ethical? There's but that's outside of the I don't know, what is it? The developing of a disciplinary or cultivated gaze or whatever it is that's happening in these texts, which is you're being apprenticed into your disciplinary understandings, I think. So there's a distinction to be made there. Is everyone from everyone comes from teaching backgrounds? No?
I don't.
But you teach now, Carl. You teach now. And Avera teachers, Steve teachers.
Using the word in its most elastic form, perhaps.
But yeah, I mean, there's lots of other teachers, Yeah. So I think that, I just think that it's a complex area. And I really like the different chapters in the book, to get back to the book, and the way that they try to look at the genre from multiple different perspectives and multiple disciplines. It really, now when I look back at it, and I think if I'm going to set a critical reflection task, I'll have a lot more knowledge about how to do that in a way that's impactful for the student, and also to show them this is what counts as successful reflection. These are what my expectations are, so that I give them the opportunity to succeed in it in a way that's meaningful for them, I think.
Namala, it's Dale.
Yes, hi, Dale.
Thanks so much. This is really, really fascinating. And in fact, what's being done with the final year B.Ed students, so teacher trainees at WITS, is they use specialization to analyze their own reflections on their teaching. And so they look at in their reflections to what extent are specialist concepts emphasized, to what extent are specialized ways of knowing and being emphasized. And I just like to pick up on what you said quite a while ago about your reticence to kind of tell the students this is what a good reflection looks like, in the fear that they'll just copy and not actually engage with their experience. What has seemed to happen in the couple of years that the final year students have been using specialization to analyze their reflections is when they do go on teaching prac later in the year, the feedback from university tutors is that their reflections are on another level, that they are moving way past the description only, and they analyze their reflections that they've done in previous years, and it's actually I love it, because in the small tutorial groups, they get quite shy and they're like, no, I don't want to show anyone because all I do is just, a blow by blow description. And they almost feel like they're quite bashful, like, oh my goodness, I didn't realize, I thought I was doing so well. But by giving them that criteria for good reflection, that from a specialization standpoint, it's set up that you need to move around the plane. Yes, you need to describe. It's important to start with the description, but don't stay there. Draw on, interpret it using your specialist knowledge, interpret it using your specialist way of being and your specialist judgment and so on. But the feedback has been that the students are writing infinitely deeper reflections where they actually get to grips with what's happening, why is it happening, how can I learn more? And I sometimes think it's maybe a little bit of a shame that they only do it in the final year of study. But yeah, so what the experience has been is that giving them that criteria hasn't resulted in just, a formula for a good reflection, but kind of a lens on how to really get the most out of looking at practice, if that makes sense.
I think it's also sorry, Lee, go ahead.
Yeah, no, just to add on what Dale's saying, I think that what's really interesting for me, Namali, is what you're talking about, and seeing how perhaps we could actually, we started using semantics, then now we're using specialization, but also how we could possibly use the axiological constellations and clusters, just as a different lens to come into. What are the students seeing in their own work? So I'm really fascinated to see how you're doing this, and how it could possibly give us another angle into this work that Dale's been talking about.
I think it depends on the kind of assignment you set as well. Like, I feel that sometimes reflections are just used by lecturers to see whether students understood a particular text, or did they understand what they're supposed to be doing? Just as a little tag on 10%, did you write a little reflection about something that, happened? And, it's not given this kind of meaningful, what you're talking about, which is meaningful. I mean, if you're a teacher, one of the things that is that the first time you run a course or you teach a lesson, you do look back on it immediately and you think, oh, I should have done this and I need to change that and it's going to be better next time around. And you get better and better at it because of that process of changing, right? So it's really valuable in certain fields. Absolutely. And giving the students, I feel that a lot of the critical reflection literature presents it from a philosophical standpoint, education philosophy, and presents it as a sort of a mysterious, challenging thing that you've just got to do it and you figure it out as you go along. It's not a mystery. It's when we were analyzing these texts across multiple disciplines, we could clearly see that there were commonalities across them. So there are expected conventions and standards for what's considered an excellent reflection, and they can be made visible and told to students. And then students can forget about the minute, what do I put where and how much description and whatever. I've been told what to do. Now let me do it. And then the next step, let me do it better, So I find that, the students, especially if it means something to them because it's useful in their profession or discipline, they really do fantastic things with it, which is always empowering. And then, you can imagine in things like the redemption narratives in de-radicalization work, it's hugely powerful.
Namali, we're going to run out of time soon. Do you want to continue through to?
Yeah, I'm done actually. I was just going to say the logical implications.
Cool.
That was it. I was just going to say it just makes visible the means by which axiological meaning is realized in disciplines. And axiological meaning, I think, until Carl started to talk about it in LCT, was just, the arts disciplines are just a mysterious place in which technicality somehow emerges from somewhere and does things that we, is specific to each discipline was, that concept was, that notion was gotten rid of. And there was this idea that, no, you can look at it as a particular type of knowledge and you can categorize it, you can identify it. It's got an incredible power within those fields. And we can talk about it in meaningful ways. So I think this is one way of going about doing that. And you can go about explicitly teaching to students, which is something that certainly in chapters where people look at pedagogical implications and how they taught it, everything, like all the different LCT tools to look at critical reflection, like Lee and Dale said, brings in all these different perspectives on an assignment that could be completely meaningless. But then guess what? With a little bit of well thought out, visible pedagogy with a great set of tools can be really powerful and meaningful for the students who engage in it.
Yeah, it's a good point. I remember like a long time ago when back when I was working in, well, before LCT became a kind of thing of its own, I was working in the Bernstein community. It was really a case of the aim was so much on trying to make knowledge visible, but it was always on explicit knowledge so much that I even remember I gave a talk on Noah structures and tried to talk about gazes and stuff. And I remember a very senior Bernstein person saying, "Oh, you mean the sort of magic stuff of the humanities?" And I was like, "Yeah, that's what I want to make visible." And they were quite dismissive about it because they were like, no, that's not what we need to make. We just need to see knowledge. And I'm like, well, this is knowledge, but you mean a kind of idealized, caricatured version of your bad misunderstanding of physics, whereas the actual real disciplinary map is replete with axiological meaning and knowers and all that sort of stuff, social relations, all that sort of stuff. So, but it's quite hard to see sometimes because it is a bit slippery, to be honest. I mean, Lucy asked a really good question earlier on about how do you nail down when it's become a cluster? It's like it can be quite difficult. It's an empirical question for me. I don't know. I think it's something you have to figure out with the data set you've got, because you may not be looking as it develops through a text. You might be looking at stuff that's already coming pre-clustered rather than being assembled. But it may be the snowball may be already huge or well established rather than building up as it goes through a text. But yeah, it's really fascinating to see these sorts of meanings being constructed and then being able to teach it, or at least make it visible.
Yeah, we showed it to the students. I mean, we showed them in these texts. This is how, yep, you got to have evaluations and emotions. And then how do you make it something that becomes then analytical? So, you go about, picking things from theoretical perspectives, relating it to your practice, building up a series of meanings, what was negative, what was positive, and thinking about how that's distributed across the different stages of the text. So, and then we were able to really work with that. And the nurses were thrilled because their discipline already had an understanding, and I found this incredible, that nursing has enormous axiological meanings embedded within it at the same time as they have the epistemological, and that it was a real balancing act. And they said, we have a concept of the aesthetics and the art of nursing, which is about the emotional, the attitudes, the interpersonal, which a lot of other disciplines don't exist, but may not look at as being an actual body of knowledge. So that was really exciting for us, I think, to then be able to work with that.
Thanks, Namali. Does anybody have any questions, comments? Anything they want to add?
Just picking up on your earlier comment, Carl, and also on Lucy's question about how you know that something is a cluster. I think we also need to look at what constellation it is part of. So what other ideas does it relate to? And one example that I can think of is the research we did on climate change disinformation. So looking at the different communities, and Namali spoke about it earlier, that one community might charge a value positively and another community negatively. If you're a climate change denier, then climate change will become a negatively charged cluster in general in that community, because they established it as a hoax. So a cluster becomes stabilized when you remove the evaluation and you only have the concept or the value or the thing, climate change. And for that person, that community, it's negative. If you're a climate change activist in an oppositional constellation, climate change will be a positive thing because we're fighting, to preserve the environment or whatever. So once you can remove the evaluation, whether it's positive or negative, and associate it with a value, then I think that cluster became stabilized. If that makes sense, and part of a particular constellation of values.
Gang, just jump in.
Yeah, thanks, Carl. Thanks very much, Lamla, for your wonderful talk. Yes, my question also, I think, is similar to Esther just explained, and also follow up on Lucy's question, how to determine the cluster. So through your presentation, can I say that can I interpret your cluster analysis like a cluster can represent a relatively general value because your cluster, in each of your cluster, you're consistent in the target and the evaluation. For example, the social workers, the client, and the polarity of the charging, they are the same polarity. So I'm thinking a little bit in SFL's perspective, coupling one evaluated and one same polarity of evaluation. So it seems that this cluster represents one same general value, right? So I can understand the logic of your analysis. So these are like the basic value, the cluster, and then you build different cluster values, then build up to the axiological constellation. Yeah, there's another question I'll ask later, but the question I ask now is this general value, do they have to be consistent in both the evaluated and the polarity charging? Is it possible to have they have different evaluate, different target, different polarity of charging, but together they can represent the same general value? Is it possible to have such a cluster? Because this cluster can also represent the same general value. So do they have, so in your presentation, it seems to that this cluster must be consistent in both the evaluated and the polarity of charging. So it's possible they may not be able to be consistent in both. Is it possible? Just
you mean that
sure.
you have the same kinds of evaluations, but different targets? I think the target is key here, in the sense that I think the target has to remain the same for us to see a stability emerging. Then we know this thing, this person, this incident, this whatever is being associated with a whole set of potentially differentiated meanings. I mean, disadvantaged gain more control, overcome obstacles. They're all different ways of expressing similar meanings, but they're all different. But because we isolate it as the priority, I consider, is given to the thing that's being evaluated, because the thing that's being evaluated allows us to establish a pattern. Now, the thing is, if the polarity is reversed, yes, absolutely, then it becomes interesting, because then you're like, oh my God, there's a reversal going on in the text. So you have to ask yourself, is this a reversal of something that's been established? So clients are always negatively charged, and then suddenly they become positively charged. That becomes an interesting instance when you are doing, because this is exactly how I would do this analysis. I just write up this table, what's being evaluated, what's the evaluation, what's the net charging, and I would just go sentence by sentence, putting them into their boxes. And then from that, you see the emerging patterns, right? But if I see that, oh, client is always negative, 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 and then suddenly client is positive, then I would be asking this question about, is something interesting going on here? Is that a deliberate reversal? And is that reversal becoming the new established world order? Or is that reversal going to be something that's used to make a point and then subverted in the end, and we go back to the previous world order? So I want to know what's going on there. But I would start by asking myself, if I see a text that's emotionally charged, can I see that the same thing is being evaluated in the same way over and over again? And it's incredible, because from the text that I've seen, and Esther's seen, and Letitia and many of us, it's exactly the same thing that's constantly being evaluated in a particular way, positively or negatively, over and over and over again. And if there's a change, something interesting is going on there. And then you have to ask yourself, by the end of the text, is it reverting back or not? There's something interesting going on there. So it does change over time, but to establish a cluster, our target or the evaluated stays the same. And then the evaluation has to have the same polarity, at least, I think, for a while in the text, for a decent chunk, for me to start to think, okay, there's a cluster being developed here, and something, it's being done for a purpose, right? The author is about to do something interesting with it. They're about to subvert it, or they're about to stabilize it to the point where it becomes an undisputed concept in their text. They might even drop all the evaluation, right? And then every single time they mention client, some of these texts are like 3,000, 5,000 words long. So by the time you get to the middle sections and you're going along, the student is no longer giving the client particular meanings associated with them. They might have gotten rid of the meanings, the evaluations, and the positive and negative charging, but you automatically associate it as being negative because you know they've trained you, in a sense, through the cluster patterns to see a client as being disempowered, disadvantaged. And that's how you read their positioning within the text until the author decides to introduce a new positive, negative charging to subvert that or challenge or destabilize that in some way. So that's what's going on, I feel. I don't know. Is that right, Esther? Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely agree. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Namla. I'm not sure. Have you examined in your study how the cluster come together to form the axiological constellation? In what relation they come together to form the constellation? Have you examined what
Yes.
kind of
So for me, this is the forming of the constellations. Okay, so these are all clusters that are emerging. So the attitudes are groups of clusters. I mean, I've simplified it greatly, right? The knowledge of falls is a group of clusters that emerge, and they're all forming each of these underlined bold. Sorry, I haven't gone into the proper visual representation, but the underlined bold sections are a little cluster that's forming that has some association to the larger constellation of nursing competency. So this idea that you've got this, here you've got nursing competency, and it is composed of knowledge, attitudes, and skills. So I am looking at how do the students unpack the concept of knowledge, attitudes, and skills through clusters, while always keeping in mind nursing competency as the overall constellation that they're building up to, affiliating with, or showing as being the disciplinary value that they are investigating, engaging with, and aligning within that particular piece of text. So yes, I am looking at how it builds up to that.